Before we get started, Talk Music Talk has a newsletter, a weekly email featuring the current week's guests, plus what past guests are up to. Also, I'll tell you about shows I've attended and new music that I like. To sign up, head on over to talkmusictalk.com, click on the link, subscribe to newsletter, and you are all set. That's talkmusictalk.com. And now for today's episode. Hello there. Welcome to another episode of Talk Music Talk with Boyce. I am Boyce, and this is my podcast that you are listening to. For the first time listener, Talk Music Talk is a weekly music interview podcast where I have long-form conversations with people who are connected to music from different genres and backgrounds, emerging and established, and points in between. And on episode 136, I had the pleasure of speaking to an incredible musician, Amir ElSafar, plays trumpet, vocalist, plays santur. He is a composer and a band leader, and he has a new double album out, just came out last week, called Not Two. It features his Rivers of Sound Orchestra, a 17-piece ensemble that fuses aspects of Middle Eastern music with jazz. He is New York based, originally from a Chicago suburb. Great conversation with him. We get into his musical background. We talk about mentors and influences, his thoughts on spirituality and religion, and the connection to his music. We also discuss his 5 years in Baghdad, where he was studying Iraqi maqam, and you will find out exactly what is maqam. He has an American mother and an Iraqi father, so we talk about how the two cultures show up in his work and also how it has affected him personally. And after the conversation, you will hear a piece from the amazing Not Two project. It's called Shards of Memory, B-half flat fantasy. And before we get to the conversation, just a few things. This episode 136 is the third of 3 consecutive episodes featuring 3 amazing jazz artists. 134 is with Josiah Woodson. He plays trumpet and guitar. And 135 with guitarist Mary Halverson. I will put the show links again. This episode is the third of 3 consecutive This episode is the third of 3 consecutive episodes featuring 3 uniquely original jazz artists. That was redundant. Finally again. This episode is the third of 3 consecutive episodes featuring 3 original jazz artists. 134 is with Josiah Woodson. He plays trumpet and guitar. And 135, Mary Halverson, who also plays guitar. I will put the links in the show notes for you. And a special thanks to publicist Nick Mulchok at Sachs & Company for setting up this conversation with Amir. And the conversation kicks off talking about the pianist who played with Amir at his record release party here in New York last week, Orwan Ortiz. I interviewed him back on episode 20 if you want to check that out. But here it is, without further ado, my conversation with Amir ElSafar on Talk Music Talk. Enjoy. Well, thank you for doing this. I appreciate it. And I did not know until I was at your show, this for the release party, your piano player. Yeah. Orwan Ortiz. I interviewed Orwan.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, like about 2 years ago.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. How'd you connect with him?
I connected with him. I'd heard his group play live several times. He actually was not on the record. He wasn't originally Craig Taborn was playing the piece, and then Craig couldn't do some of the performances.
Yeah.
And I had heard Orwan, and I felt like he was somebody that could get into this sound. Especially with the retuned piano with all these microtones, I felt like he was somebody that could actually extract something interesting and maybe create his own sound out of that, which he's done in brilliant ways. So he's an extraordinary musician.
It's 17 people?
17 musicians.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what do you look for in choosing those people?
Everybody in that ensemble, everybody in Rivers of Sound is a musician that I've worked with over the years in different contexts. And in fact, you could actually draw several subsets from that ensemble. Like my Two Rivers ensemble has been active for over 10 years. That's like the six musician band that forms the core of Rivers of Sound. There's another ensemble called the Alwan ensemble that does traditional Arabic music with 4 of the members. So that's also inside of the Rivers of Sound. I have another group that does Iraqi music and etc. So, of course, the level of musicianship, the sound of each musician, like the particular way that they, not only their timbre, but the way that they think, the way that they understand, the way they listen to others. But most important, there's this element of friendship. And everybody in the band is a close friend and somebody that I've had some, of course, through the music, you develop these bonds, but also, something a little bit beyond that, where we're very close. So I felt like that element, and it sort of came together in this very natural way. But some people that I've played with, of course, my sister and her husband, who I played with, my sister and I have been singing songs since we were very
she's in the band?
Yeah, she's the violinist.
Okay.
Jason Adashevitz, the vibraphonist, and I have played together since high school. We lost touch for 10 years and reconnected. Mohammed Saleh, the oboe player, was in the Weimar Orchestra, which Edward Said and Daniel Barenboim put together in 1999. And so he and I met then, and he was kind of the first person to bring me to Egypt to introduce me to Egyptian musicians. So it's kind of everybody. There's a story. There's some history. J.D. Perrin was in Cecil Taylor's large ensemble with me from 2002 to 2005. So when we play together, we were able to sort of set a certain frequency or resonance that harkens to that era and that time with Cecil. So, so it's not only there's this friendship, but then there's a whole context and the whole story around that friendship. That then it kind of spread, and then the members of the ensemble that didn't know each other before developed these bonds too. So it kind of came together in this really beautiful way. Yeah.
What skill do you think it takes for you to be a band leader, to be a good band leader?
I think it's a lack of skill.
Okay.
lack of organizational skills, lack of planning ahead. It kind of comes together in this way that I'm learning, but it doesn't, like being very well organized in the way that it takes to bring 17 people together. I generally don't. I'm not good at that. I'm not very good at organizing my own life, as you can see from the desk over here with piles of papers and bills that I have to go through. And but I think it comes from a sense of spirit and a sense of determination and a sense of inspiration and intuition. I think that's where my strengths are, and in composing as well. I don't necessarily plan things out methodically. I follow emotions, and I follow intuitions and sort of a sense of reason and logic and what makes sense. And in the process of putting the pieces together, the structure starts to form. And then I become aware of that, and I can observe it and allow it to happen. But I'm not one of these people who's able to like organize a whole set and put together everything in this sort of clean, methodical way, and then everything comes off without a hitch. Okay. So like our rehearsal process was messy, but that messiness is actually part of the sound. The fact that the scores were incomplete, the fact that there was little, missing notes, or missing half sharps, and so people had to ask me lots of questions in the process of the rehearsal, like, Amir, what do you mean here? And also had to ask themselves questions and had to pay attention to what was going on in the ensemble and listen to what the other musicians were doing. So rather than everybody being buried in the sheet music and saying, okay, this is, if I just play what's on the page, everything will work, which is the kind of the mentality of playing in a symphony orchestra, or the other extreme, which would be like a completely free improvised situation where nobody's just looking at music and just listening. I'm trying to find that in-between space between composition and improvisation. Okay. And because of my process, because I finish the scores last minute, and sometimes I'm writing them in the rehearsals, things have to be worked out. And it's this, again, that friendship, the camaraderie, the sense of compassion that develops among the musicians. it's a constant negotiation, or we're forming something together, and that's what I think really comes across in this music. And when I listen back to it as well, there's a sense of a collective, and that it's not individuals, but we're all working toward, and we maintain our individuality, but working toward some group sound that toward beauty, toward whatever the highest ideals that we have. But yeah.
And how did you discover that you want part of it, what's on the page, but also to bring into their own style and to the music?
Yeah.
It's not just do what I say on this page.
Yeah, because I don't like, I feel like there's a sense of the composer being this. There's certain egotistic quality that gets, and there's certain, like my brain and my ideas and my sensibilities, and then everybody else has to kind of just honor that. Like in classical music, you're taught that the composer is God, and like the conductor could be like a priest or something. There's all this kind of hierarchy that happens, and then the musicians are the either they could be the subjects or they could be the workers, and I'm trying to remove that hierarchy and really get a sense that we're all equals. And yes, I'm the person who got the gig and the record recording session. I brought everybody there, whatever, and I wrote out these scores. But ultimately, I want the scores to be a point of departure, and I've been working with that process for a long time.
Okay.
I think playing with Cecil Taylor was a really important learning experience. I mean, it was on so many levels, but in particular with regard to the specificity, non-specificity, like where, yes, there's infinite interpretation of a phrase, and yet there's a particular sensibility or a particular aesthetic or a particular way of understanding this phrase that one has to get inside of before they can do it justice or do it in the way that the phrase wants. And that's true in Iraqi music and Arabic music in general. There's a melody that everybody knows that this is, the performers all understand that that's the basic melody, but it's always open to interpretation, and the variations are the essence. It's not like here's the basis and then you can vary on it. The basis doesn't exist without variations.
Okay.
So again, it's very specific. It's precise. The tuning is precise. The contour is precise, and yet the ways of interpreting it are infinite. And that, to me, as a listener, as well as a performer, is much more exciting and interesting because every performance will be different, and every performance will, you can respond to the environment. Like in our concert, when the church bells went off, in that perfect moment, it was in the middle of the piano. The one moment the piano's left all alone, retuned piano, and then you have microtonal church bells, and I didn't. Of course, you can't plan it, but it happens, and then you let that become, it's open. I'm interested in the sound and the music, the presentation being something always open, and not a closed book, not set. I don't like things that are set.
Okay. Yeah. And did you have to learn, outside of the organizational thing, which you said you need work on, do you have to learn how to manage people? Was that a skill you
Well, that's
needed?
one of the things that, is so nice about this ensemble is that not only, everyone's friendly and has a good attitude and good vibe, and across the board, not a single person ever has given me, bad energy or bad. But people are self-sufficient and able to take. Like when the bass player arrived in Abu Dhabi and was picked up in a vehicle that was too small to take his bass, and he starts texting me, and I was asleep. Okay, I mean, he's in a foreign country, doesn't speak the language. Mind you, everyone speaks English there, but he worked it out. Like he found the phone number, called. When the bass saxophonist arrived in Cleveland and his bass saxophone didn't come with. I didn't even know about it until he'd already filed the claim with the baggage people, and within 3 hours on the next flight, the bass saxophone was there. So everybody kind of takes care of themselves and looks out for the other, and that sensibility, you don't see in a lot of professional situations where it's just like, well, this is my part, and I'm not. You got a problem, I got nothing to do with that, and that's kind of like this individualistic attitude that I see a lot of these days, and this ensemble, that doesn't exist. People are really looking out for each other.
Okay.
So yeah. So managing people, yeah, I mean, I know everybody well enough. So I know like certain people that you have to email them 5 times.
Yeah.
You got to send them a reminder in the morning. Hey, we're rehearsing today. You know, that kind of stuff. But again, it comes from familiarity and keeping that like human quality. I do have an assistant, and she does a lot of the, you know, emails, the group emails, and setting up all the rehearsals and making sure everybody brings what they need to and all that.
Okay. Are there different skills required when you're working with a orchestra as opposed to, say, your quintet? Like as it gets larger?
Yeah, for sure. But I mean, it's the same principles. So, I mean, a lot of times when you have a smaller group, it's like you have intimacy, and you can have a lot more spontaneity and improvisation. The larger the group gets, the less, of course, the less intimate, and also the less you can leave things open, like you need to set things. I try to allow the same aesthetic, so that actually what happens in the large group is you have many smaller like I was describing, these smaller ensembles, but spontaneously within the rehearsal process and the performance, smaller groups develop from, so you have in a 17-piece band 4 chamber ensembles. You know, the guitarist and the oud player are relating to each other. The cellist and the violin are hooking up with the piano here. So there's always the same aesthetic of a small group, even though the group's getting larger, and the next project is going to be even larger. But that's that's 2 years out. Yeah.
And was the trumpet your first instrument?
You could say so. I started out actually. I started on the trumpet when I was 9, but I wasn't very enthusiastic about it. I didn't enjoy playing trumpet very much. I started playing ukulele and then guitar when I was 10, and that was really my passion, because I was into the Beatles, and then I was into Rolling Stones, and that eventually took me into late 60s, Eric Clapton and Jimi Hendrix, and then I got into the blues. But all that music was guitar and vocal based. So I was singing and playing guitar. And writing my own songs, quite a bit from the ages of 10 to 14, 15.
Of a classic rock vein?
Yeah, classic rock. You know, what they called the British invasion, which is so interesting because they were all listening to blues. And I mean, they were all influenced by Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf and Robert Johnson, of course, who was sort of, you know, the generation before all of them. And here I was living in Chicago, and I'm thinking, wait, Muddy Waters, didn't he live in Chicago? He's from Mississippi, but moved to Chicago. And my father, who was really, I mean, he's from Iraq, but his passion, he always said, I like to listen to black music. I want to listen to black music. It was like his thing. So he had this, you know, CD changer and 5 CDs, and it was like James Brown, B.B. King, Muddy Waters, it was Aretha Franklin. I mean, it was all, and that was the music that he felt passionate about. And he used to take me to this blues club on the south side of Chicago called the Checkerboard Lounge. And we went several times in my childhood, and then I would go there regularly like when I was in college. It was right in the middle of the South Side, and 43rd Street and Martin Luther King Drive. And that was like, you know, it was like going to church every time. And that was such an important, so it kind of connected, you know, what I was listening to. You know, the Beatles were a little bit further removed because they're more influenced by Elvis, but especially the Rolling Stones and sort of Clapton, and they're all, you know, it's like, okay, where did that music come from? So then I started to go into the roots of it, and I was just listening to Muddy Waters, and then that took me to and Buddy Guy, early Buddy Guy, and that took me to Robert Johnson and Lead Belly, and I was listening to that earlier generation, and just like it just was haunting me, and that sound was pulling me to something very, very deep. I didn't understand why exactly until later, until I discovered the connection with Iraqi music and the similarities. But then eventually I kind of came back up through the history and into jazz. And like Robert Johnson, then to Charlie Christian, you know, and then that took me into some of the trumpet players, but really Miles Davis was, you know, listening to Miles for the first time. As somebody who was into rock guitar and into like Hendrix and into blues, hearing So What, which was that kind of aesthetic.
Okay, so it's the fusion stuff that you...
Well, so what? They called cool. I don't know.
Cool. Okay,
but
I'm thinking of the later stuff.
Yeah,
okay.
no, it was. Yeah, actually, it took. No, I started with like kind of blue, which is unfortunate everybody. But also it was the modality of it, which ties into Arabic music.
Okay,
like the mode of so what is very similar to the main mode of Iraqi and Turkish and Egyptian, and I mean there's this connection through the sound. So, and
what is the connection with blues and Iraqi music?
So the first time I'd heard Iraqi music growing up, but I didn't really understand what was going on until I went to Baghdad in 2002.
Okay,
March 20th, 2002, I arrived, and I spent most of that year in Iraq, and I had some teachers, and I'd been listening to these recordings, and I just didn't really get what was going on. But somehow, having one teacher to kind of give me some little bit of guidance in a way, and then I had this epiphany moment where I was listening to the music on my headphones and sitting in the room. It was a very hot day, and the sun was coming through the window. I mean, it's like one of these moments you never forget, the light, and this piece was going, and I understood from the teacher that there was a structure. Okay, it wasn't just an improvisation. It was like following this compositional structure, but it's very loose and very free at the same time, like the specific, non-specific. And then he started going to this like yodeling, ululation, whatever the proper term, and it was just like it was crying, and it was really, and I just had the same feeling I heard when I heard Robert Johnson making that almost the same sound. But, we're talking about tens of thousands of miles and years and generations of separation. And yet there was some, what is that? It was hitting my emotional core in the same way. It is the blues. I mean, there's blues, there's a specific form of the blues, and there's a specific experience of the blues, but there's also, I mean, even Miles said, "Oh yeah, flamenco." I won't imitate his voice. I hate it when people imitate his voice.
That was good so far.
I started okay, but I won't go anymore. But he said that flamenco is the blues of the people in the south of Spain.
Okay.
So it's like it's seeing it as a human phenomenon. Like
so everyone has their blues.
Yeah. And the south of Iraq, they between all of the massacres and I mean there's the stories of suffering go, and the way that people express it, you find, of course, many different lenses or filters, but the basic core emotion is a human experience. So, so I really felt that in listening to this particular Iraqi singer, and so I understood emotionally what was going on. And then there's a whole history that's sort of now being uncovered of African American of slaves that were Muslim that were reciting Quran and using maqam in their singing early on, that then translated to different types of singing, and that sort of almost, I mean, I wonder, like when Duke Ellington wrote Caravan and Far East Suite, and when Coltrane, of course, was exploring Indian music, but also Middle Eastern music, like what were they tapping into? Because we're not always conscious of I don't know what I'm tapping into most of the time, but there's some resonance that can be on an ancestral level or a collective unconscious, where there's actually a lot more connections than we're ever going to be conscious of. So,
And you mentioned maqam.
Yeah.
Explain what that is. It's a genre of music?
It's actually a system, like it's a modal system.
Okay.
So in the sense that, like in Western music, you have, major and minor and 1, 4, 5, just to be very basic. It starts there, and then you have the infinite variations. And then Western major and minor stems from Greek modes. There's 7 main modes there's 7 note scales, so like the white notes on the piano, C to C, D to D, E to E. You can extract all the modes. That's actually a system that started in Babylon in 1750 BC, and in a slightly different way. Or at least we have evidence from that era. It's probably much, much older. But maqam actually has the same starting point, which is these modes, 7 note modes. But where it starts to develop complexity is within the intervals. So you can actually, instead of having an E natural, you can have a note that's a little bit flatter than E, but it's not quite E flat.
Yeah.
It's like, so that it becomes microtonal. But always 7 notes. And these, then, you just variation upon variation, you can slightly, like there's a major mode, one that's like the major scale. Then there's a mode that's almost like the major scale, but the third is slightly lower. Then there's a mode like the minor scale. There's a mode like the minor scale, but the second degree is a quarter tone lower. So you have actually hundreds and hundreds of possibilities. At any point in history, probably 70 to 100 that are actually used in practice. So you have these very rich possibilities of variation with. And maqam exists as a modal system in all of North Africa, so basically from Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, in the Gulf, most of the Gulf, parts of the Sudan, but most of the Sudan, it goes into more pentatonic, which is more common for the rest of Africa, but this 7-note maqam modes throughout the Levant, which is Lebanon, Palestine, Syria, now modern-day Israel, that area, Iraq, Turkey, Iran, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, all the way to Western China, Xinjiang province of Western China. It's a huge part of the world that's using some variation of this modal system. So it's a kind of amazing. I mean, it's sort of like raga is to India. It's similar.
And you learned this when you were in Baghdad, or you?
Yeah, I didn't really start learning until I was in my mid-20s. I'd heard it growing up, but like I said, I didn't really know how to relate to it for the longest time. Yeah.
And when did you officially, so you were on the ukulele and guitar? Yeah. When did you return to trumpet or take it seriously? Yeah. When did that happen?
Really when I was 14, when I heard Miles. Around the same time, when I was 13, I started learning a trumpet concerto by Haydn. That got me a little bit interested in the trumpet. But it was, so I was learning classical music throughout, but I was always more interested in improvisation and interested in there was a certain trajectory. But yeah, and hearing Miles, and then I got in, of course, to bebop and Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie and Monk and Bud Powell, and was transcribing, and then Clifford Brown and Freddie Hubbard, and I got into that whole trajectory, and then throughout my high school and part of my college, I was really listening to that era, like 40s, 50s, 60s jazz. Yeah. And I wasn't getting into I wasn't getting into free or, Ornette Coleman was kind of where I stopped, or Cecil, I was just starting to listen. And I listened, big band stuff, of course, Basie and Ellington, and, played a lot of that stuff. And Louis Armstrong was always kind of throughout. But I didn't get into like the later strains. And also growing up in the 90s, we were all listening to I wasn't so much into Wynton, but I was really into like Roy Hargrove and Terence Blanchard, and they were just coming out at that time. And I was okay, these are like the people that are doing something new, but I could really relate to it because it was stemming directly from that. They weren't playing fusion, and they weren't playing, and they were very far from what had happened in the 60s and 70s and early 80s, and they were, almost like a neoclassical.
See, I would have thought the jazz rock would have been right up your
I got into
alley.
Bitches Brew, and I got into In a Silent Way, but it was, but I wasn't like getting deep into Live Evil, or I got into it much later, because I think, I don't know, I think at that age maybe I wanted more structure or something. I don't know. But when I moved to New York, or maybe toward the end of my college, I mean, Woody Shaw was actually like the kind of the last trumpet player that really, I was like studying and transcribing his solos and trying to learn to play all these wide interval things. But I was really like wanting the structure. And then it was actually coming to New York, but in particular meeting Cecil Taylor that, when I was able to break free from it and start to be able to see things from multiple perspectives at the same time, and be able to listen to negative space and not just what's being played, but also the silence and what's not being played, and then really breaking the structures up. Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because people are like, oh, you're from Chicago, where you listen? And I didn't, I mean, I was aware of the AACM, I had listened, but I didn't know how to listen to a lot of those recordings until much later. Not that I could say I know how to listen to anything.
Yeah.
But, you know, always questioning what I know.
Was this all self-discovery, or did you have someone sort of guiding you?
I had different teachers. There were some at DePaul University where I went to school, but they were of the jazz education world, which I quickly, you know, broke away from. But there were a lot of, I mean, in Chicago, I was gigging a lot, and I was playing with blues bands, and I was playing with R&B bands. Like, I was a regular member of a few of these groups, and then, but also doing salsa and doing this. I mean, it was just, you know, Greek weddings and bar mitzvahs, and just whoever called me, I'd show up. And I had a couple of teachers. One of them, Ridresh Mahantapa, when he was still in Chicago, and really he was probably the first to pull me out of like thinking in terms of bebop and like understanding late Coltrane and what he was doing with modes and also and rhythm and sort of looking at things from a wider angle. And when I moved to New York,
this is after school?
Yeah, I came straight out of school. Straight when I finished at DePaul, I moved to New York the following year. And I had a couple of teachers here, but I don't know if I had... It was more like just different people that would come in. Like Vijay was important to me at a few stages. I mean, he was the person that recommended that I join this workshop that Cecil Taylor was leading, and that kind of led me in one direction.
Okay.
And, he encouraged me a lot when I was thinking about going to Iraq. And he had like this important role. Yeah. But I didn't have like a particular mentor. I took lessons with a guy named John McNeil, trumpet player you may have heard of. But yeah, it's funny. Most of my mentors are like, I had a Zen Buddhist teacher for years, and I've had different people coming in my life from different. I was thinking about this morning actually. I was thinking about who came to my show, and I was like, oh, this Tai Chi teacher that I'm studying with. It wasn't like my musical teachers or all these other.
But you still learned from them. In some way.
Because it's energy at the end.
So I am curious, what does your Zen Buddhist teacher in Tai Chi, you said?
Yeah,
how do they affect your music?
I have to talk about musical mentors a little bit after. But to answer the question, well, interesting. Like this piece that we premiered, or we just played the release show of on Friday is called Not Two, and that's came directly from something that my Zen teacher in Chicago told me years and years ago when I was always like, you know, between this and that, this should be this or that. I was questioning and kind of vacillating and back and forth. And one day he told me, you know, when your mind is in dualistic thinking, I think he was quoting somebody, but I don't remember who. But if your mind is involved in dualistic thinking, think not two, and all will become clear. Okay. And that way is really interesting for me, especially because because I'm a Libra, or maybe I tend to be indecisive and always consider and weigh the options. And this idea of not two, you know, it's a way of saying one. Everything is one. All is one. Unity. But when you somehow the not two actually honors the fact that there's these two poles, or you know, could be yin and yang, could be positive, negative, whatever it is. But when you see the two as being in relation, you know, there's so many ways to understand this idea, but there's a dynamic. You know, when you and I are speaking, there's me as an individual, you as an individual, but there's also whatever the energy is of the two of us having this interaction. And so, like, what's going on in that dynamic? So that's interesting. When I'm trying to decide between two things, it's almost a sense of, okay, well, not two. Okay, well, you move forward. It liberates the mind in a certain way. And it's kind of a koan, as in like something you could contemplate and come up with. Instead of letting it paralyze you. Yeah. And not making any decision. Right. Okay. I mean, it's become, which we've all been there. I'm sure It's like, oh my God, I'm so overwhelmed. I'm just going to not leave the house today. Check my Facebook or something. Distract ourselves. But yeah, I think... But he was a very, very... Unfortunately, he died just around the time I finished school, just before I moved to New York. But I really... learning meditation from him, and he was very, very, sharp and going directly to the heart of the matter. I mean, he just constantly clearing away the BS and whatever didn't fit, and he was really sharp. And he was a musician too, American, with first Zen Roshi, American Roshi. Name was Kongo Roshi, and he was a jazz pianist and classical pianist, and then found Zen and kind of went in that direction. He was also a Tai Chi and Qigong practitioner. But I only recently got back into Qigong, and I found a very good teacher here.
Okay.
I haven't spoken to him afterward, but it's breath and it's understanding. Like, for instance, I understood a melody that I wrote 2 years ago. Now that I've been doing Qigong like every day for the last several months, and sort of understanding how breath informs movement, I started to see where the inhalation and the exhalation, where the, and levels of breath, like smaller waves and larger, and there's sort of like seeing the whole, you can see this macro, and sort of being able to, like, for instance, in Qigong, your arm might be lifting, but it's not, you're using, of course, the muscles, but the movement is actually coming from the center of your body, and the inhalation, and then the natural result of that is just the arm moving upwards. So things like that, then you can understand the waves in music. You can understand these larger vibrations in terms of energetic movement. And of course, you need to understand the smaller details of pitch and rhythm and melodic contour, but they end up being much more about waves, about breath.
What made you decide to go into Buddhism?
I think I just constantly, from as far back as I can remember, I mean, I can remember I went to a Lutheran school, not because my family was Lutheran, but because it was a good school, but they taught us about God. My mother was a Jungian analyst. She was like a psychoanalyst. She was a Spanish literature scholar who then became a psychoanalyst. But I think she was always questioning. I mean, she was a philosopher, mystic, kind of on this journey all the time. And took me to astrologers and palm readers when I was very young. And I think I just always was looking for truth or looking for answers and trying to understand whether it's inner confusion or looking out the world and things that didn't make sense, and trying to understand suffering and why is this person on the street and that person is living comfortably driving a Mercedes. I mean, even very young, asking these questions and going to a Lutheran school, and they were teaching us about God, and I used to say, like, okay, do I really believe in God, or am I just saying I do because I'm supposed to? Like, I was when I was 5, I got in a fight with a kid about whether God existed. And I said, yes, he absolutely exists. And this person said, no, God doesn't exist. Yeah. And then he bit me on my chest. And I still have the scar at the bottom of my sternum. His teeth, I don't know how he managed to. But I was like, I don't know. So these things have been, but I also used to look, because growing up in a household that, my father was not a practicing Muslim and my mother was not a practicing Christian, but I encountered these religions and I was always trying to understand, well, this seems totally like, people believe in this and they're 100% that's the truth, and there's also someone else saying, well, this is true, and there's a contradiction. So I used to say, well, either they're all wrong or they're all right, or this, trying to understand, and then never mind, reading into philosophy, and then I used to, when I first found the Tao Te Ching, as a 14-year-old, I was just blown away by this Lao Tzu text from him, and just understanding what does it mean to say the good traveler travels with no plans. Like, what does that? Trying to or the way that can be. The way that is spoken is not the true way, but then you're speaking. It's like always just asking. So, I think trying to and I lost my mother when I was 16. And my father had a lot of illness and was paralyzed for a while, and then eventually recovered. And there was a lot of sort of turmoil in my family, and then being half Iraqi, half American. So I was always trying to sort of reconcile differences, like understand, okay, how can this religion be true and that religion be true? How can these people say that about these people, but they all seem to be cool? Like it's like always trying to, and I think. Again, not to, it was a way sitting meditation, getting out of because in the realm of the intellect, you can find contradictions that are sort of unreconcilable.
Yeah.
But then when you go into intuition or into when your mind expands, you can see how things that seem to be inherently contradictory are actually working in harmony.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm interested in. I'm trying to understand. So in everything that I do, it's like sort of, whether it's because my parents didn't get along, I was trying to like smooth the differences between them, or something internally where I was trying to understand, conflicting thoughts or conflicting, so somehow I was always looking for like a mystical, spiritual approach. And even when I started learning about Islam much later, and I'm not practicing Muslim, but I did read the Quran at different points, and trying to understand it through a mystical lens rather than the specifics about, okay, if you do this, you get punished, and if you do that, you get a reward. Okay, that's really basic level thinking, but what does that punishment mean? Like, what does it mean that, God is angry if you do that? Okay, well, you keep doing wrong things to people, you can call it karma, or you can call it whatever you want, but like I was thinking about it yesterday, when you don't share, people who don't like to share, they're all alone in the world. You keep everything like this. People who are very, very rich and they're living in a tower somewhere, and the more they have, the more they're closing off, and they don't want to give to anybody, and they're holding on tight, and so anyway, it's basic, but it's, it's like, we should pay attention to these things sometimes. So.
And I'm curious too, when so you go to school, you come to New York. How far are you from your first album?
So I moved to New York in 2000, and I was sort of lost for the first year. I thought I didn't have any business playing with anyone in the city, so I was just locking myself up in the room, practicing like 8 hours a day, like, learning these modes and and I would go out at night and listen to people play. And trying to understand, where did I fit within all this. But again, like I was mentioning, Rudresh, Vijay, Liberty Elman, those guys had all just moved to New York a little bit before me, and they were getting their footing here. And that was what they were doing made more sense to me than other. I mean, I went to Smoke, I went to Smalls, Tonic at the time was very active. The whole what was called downtown scene, and I enjoyed a lot of things, but where I felt like I could resonate was. In what these musicians, this particular scene, that was kind of drawing on non-Western roots, and also expanding what's known, like the known code of jazz was somehow getting taken to its next manifestation or next extension. And that was really interesting to me. And it's a very different scene today than it was in 2000, but it was very compartmentalized.
Yeah.
And so eventually, I started gigging. I started my own band. I did a record, like it never came out, but with Nasheed and Vijay and Donnie McCaslin and Carlo, the bassist, who's still with me.
Yeah, no, Donnie.
Yeah, and then I moved, completely switched gears. I went to Iraq in 2002, and I knew that it was after 9/11. So I was here when 9/11 happened. I was in my apartment in Brooklyn. And witnessed all of that was going on, and I decided then, like, I better find a way to get to Iraq.
Yeah.
And I was entering a jazz trumpet competition. It was $10,000. I said, well, if I get this prize, it wasn't even if. It's like I have to get this prize so that I can go, because there's the attack on Iraq, a war in Iraq is imminent. I knew at that point.
Yeah.
It was exactly a year and a half.
You felt unsafe here, or?
No, I didn't feel unsafe. I felt like I really wanted to understand the music. Okay. I felt a pull to understand it. And no, if anything, it's more unsafe to be there.
Yeah.
No, I didn't feel like under threat or discrimination or, not much.
Yeah.
But no, it was like a calling. It was like, and I knew that I had very little time. So I went to Iraq, and I spent, like I said, most of 2002. I left at the beginning of 2003. But just so I could start studying the music. Yeah. And then I thought I was going to come back, and then I wasn't ready to come back yet. And so I found different teachers living. Some were in Aleppo in Syria, and there's some in Cairo. These were Syrian and Egyptian musicians. But then I found some of my most important Iraqi mentors living in Europe as refugees. So there was one in Munich, and one in London, and a group in Amsterdam. And I was like I was living with them basically, like spending weeks and weeks and just like lessons all day, like getting this very intense kind of apprenticeship for about 5 years.
Okay.
So then I came back to New York in 2006, and I got 2 commissions. They both came at the same time. One was from the Festival of New Trumpet Music, which Dave Douglas, he emailed me, personally emailed me and said, I want you to write a piece. And the other came from the Painted Bride in Philadelphia, which had commissioned several composers to write non-Western jazz pieces. So in 2006, both the Two Rivers, my first piece, premiered at both venues.
Yeah.
And then the New York show, the Pi Records came out, Yulin Wang came out, and the next day emailed me, and a year later the record came out on Pi. And so that's 2007.
Okay.
So basically it was about 7 years. I didn't just like move to New York and get my first record. It was more like move to New York. My mind, is swirling and confused and feeling inadequate and inept and not up to it and practicing like crazy. And then I had to, and then I won this prize. And I was finally like, okay, now I'm ready to, because that prize was actually something, Carmine Caruso, it's a well-known jazz trumpet competition. And the judges were Ingrid Jensen and Tim Higgins and people that could have like gotten me some gigs and helped them because they were really supportive. And then I just took off, 2 months later. It's almost like I was just about to start something. I was in a position like now I'm going to take another left turn.
Because you felt that strongly about.
Yeah.
Without actually knowing what was going to happen.
I didn't know. I thought I was going to stay for a few weeks, honestly. And like, okay, learn some modes and some rhythms and like write some new tunes. And it ended up being this deep, deep immersion. And even after Two Rivers came out in 2007 and I was getting 2008, 2009, I did a record with Hafez Modirzadeh called Radif Suite, and it was a lot of microtonal stuff that was not even maqam based, and then going further and further in different directions. But I was, for about a decade, till about 2012, very maqam centered, immersed,
What was it about maqam?
I think this is something specific about Iraqi maqam that pulled me in, and there was 2 levels. One was the, like I was mentioning a little bit earlier, there's this intellectual component. It's very highly structured and highly organized and it's this kind of a perfect system in a way, but it's also open. Like new melodies can be added, melodies can be dropped, but there's a way that each melody relates to the next, and like, okay, let's say there's a maqam called Bayat. It's a composition, but it's free. So the rhythm is not set. So the vocal line, it's almost all vocal, he's singing a poem, is completely, he can do whatever he wants rhythmically, but it should stay within the melodic phrasing, he or she, because there are female singers, it's another topic. But, and then there's one melody, and then it's followed by another, and followed by another. Now that melody, that maqam bayat, the main melody, you'll hear it appear in other maqams as like a secondary or tertiary melody, as like something you go into and come out of. So the maqams all exist within one another. So it's not just like all these separate phrases. They actually all inform one another. So as a whole system of about 60 compositions, you can find these sort of constellations between, maqam bayat has a melody called Nawa, which is another maqam. It has a melody called Ajam, which is another maqam. It has a melody called Lawuk, which is and it also has this geographical component. Like Lawuk is a Kurdish melody. Siaga is a Persian melody. Beherzawi is from a small village north of Baghdad. Then there's a maqam called Mukhalif, which is a story, comes from 1258 when Baghdad was sacked by the Mongols. There's a maqam called Medmi, which is a story of somebody seeing his brother being stabbed in a battle. And it's Medmi means bloody. I mean, it's like really intense names. So it's the lore of the culture. It's the history. It's at least 1,000 years of history being told through melody. It's like, griot tradition or like bards that are telling these epic poems, but in musical code. So that was fascinating to me. Like, okay, this is musical code. It's semi-improvised, yet it's composed. The pieces have their structures. They have a way that they're put together, that they have to be done. If they're not done that way, then they're considered wrong and antithetical to performance practice. And yet, I would listen to 10 recordings of the same maqam and hear, like, is this the same piece?
Yeah.
Like, there's no way that that's the same as it, because he went up here and they went down there, and and then, like, listening over and over. And then I had this great teacher, Hamid Saadi, and he's probably one of my very, very important mentors, to get to the topic again. But he would sit with me for hours and hours and hours, and I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't grow up with the music like others did, but he was patient, and he would make me go through the phrase and learn it precisely, exactly the way he did it. And once I went through that process, then I could listen to those 10 recordings and understand, it's a variation of this. Okay, I understand where he diverged or where she went down and then it started to all come into. I started to understand the system, and that process, it was like almost, it was an obsession on the intellectual level, like just to understand this code, and then the lore and the stories, and I was just so just yearning to connect to Iraqi culture, and I couldn't, especially I really fell in love with Iraq when I was there, and then I felt like I was torn away from it because of this impending war, and so the melodies were a way to connect to this history, and okay, so this happened in 1258. This happened. It was a way of and then the poetry also is its other component. The poems tell stories about Ottoman generals that massacres or even some just the way that people drink tea in this particular part of Iraq or put too much salt in this and the well and the what does water mean to people in the desert. It was all this lore, so I could get into the deeper understanding of the subconscious of this culture that I was, grew up really far away from, coming from a Chicago suburb, and I wanted to, it's like I wanted to make love to this, I wanted to be in it, and just how can I, and I'm far away, so this was my way of just being somehow immersing. It's like a physical experience. It's not just, so I said intellectual. And then the emotionality that comes out of it, which I was talking about the blues, and I was talking about, again, yearning. And I think maybe my experience, because I had the experience of touching it and spending time there and then being away from it. And I was feeling this intent, just desire and also my experience losing my mother. It was and now Iraq, and I wanted to be there, and I couldn't. And so when I'd hear the singer wailing and yodeling, and yodeling is a form of crying and singing, and it's just yes, that's the feeling. That's what I'm going through right now, sitting alone in this room in London where I don't know anybody, and trying to go to this tea. I really kind of was living like a monk in that period. I didn't have any relationships or any. I was just my teacher, my recordings of the lessons, and for about 5 years.
So how do you then decide, to take that immersion and place it into jazz?
That was the commission, and I didn't want to do it at first, and I was like, you know what? I took the commission. I needed the money. I did it for the money. And
people have done worse.
Yeah, I know. Yes.
For less.
Right, precisely. I needed the money, and no, but honestly, it was. I started, and I was like, man, this music is perfect. It's pure. It's beautiful. It's so delicate. You're gonna put a drum set in there. You're gonna mix it with jazz. It's not gonna. I love. I was playing with. My gigs with Cecil were during that period too. So I was flying back to the States to do a week with Cecil at the Iridium, and then go back to my maqam. It was like that for those periods. And then I was like, well, you know what? Here's what we're going to do. I'm going to do a set. And the first 40 minutes is going to be maqam. The second 40 minutes is going to be jazz. And because these do not mix. And it was 2006, and it was the height of the civil war, that was sectarian violence in Iraq. There was the American occupation was going really badly. And, I was also internally conflicted about, this is my culture, that's my culture, and I didn't know how to sort of exist between the two. And it was and so musically, I also didn't know how to exist between them. And then at some point, I was just playing with ideas and said, no, I really should do this, like make it work. And then, like, okay, this maqam has D, E half flat, F, G flat. Okay, and then there's a C up there. Okay, well, if you put the F and the G flat and the C together, that's like a sharp 9 chord. If you put the G flat at the bottom and the F at the top, that's the Jimmy chord.
Okay.
Like, that's the Jimi Hendrix chord. That's Purple Haze.
Yeah.
Okay, and that's also, of course, Monk, and everybody else has used it. All right, so wait, and then I build the extension, go to the B flat. Okay, we're still in the mode. Okay, this chord equals that maqam. And they actually have a very similar emotion to it. And then, okay, what if I play this maqam? How would Cecil Taylor interpret this maqam with a group of 14 musicians or 28 musicians? Oh, okay, let's try that. And then this beat is like, this is James Brown. It's got the similar backbeat, or it sounds like Parliament, actually, maybe even closer to Parliament. Okay, so can we now turn this around and fit them? Can they fit together? So then, then it was bring this idea to. I chose my musicians, Nasheed and Carlo. Rudresh was the saxophonist at the beginning. Zafar and Tarek. That's the same basic band, except now Ule Matisen is playing instead of Rudresh saxophone. And then we'd bring these rhythms and maqams and stuff together, and it just started to, boom, like pieces started to, and then as it went on, more and more of these blanks started to fill in. And so at the beginning, it was really like this stream and that stream, two rivers. It was combining this and that tradition, known elements, like previously existing elements, bring them together. Backbeat plus this 12 rhythm, maqam and the sharp 9 chord, all these things. And then after a while, so that was the first two rivers piece. After a while, those differences just started to fall away, and I just found the essence. And then once you find the essence, the possibilities really open up, because you don't have to think about it, where it came from or what code it belongs. Like now I write, I don't know, is this maqam, is this Stravinsky, I don't know where it's coming from anymore. So then it's more interesting.
Yeah. And for kind of fast forwarding to Not 2, when did the gestation for that idea for that come?
Interestingly, the first gig that Two Rivers ever played after the album was released was a large ensemble, Two Rivers Large Ensemble. Okay. Somebody in Chicago heard the album and said, I want you to do this with a large group, with Chicago musicians. I said, great, let's do it. So in 2008, we did something outdoors, and it was basically the Two Rivers suite, but Jason Adashevich was playing vibes, and we had this large group of Jeff Parker and Jeff Bradfield, saxophonist, really, really good Chicago musicians, plus Two Rivers. And that, to me, was actually what I'd originally hoped the music could become, which was, again, because I'd just been playing with Cecil a couple of years before that, in these large groups. And so from that point, the following year, we did it again at Lincoln Center Out of Doors with New York musicians. And then I started applying for funding to do it again, and no one was giving me a grant. And I'm kind of glad they didn't, because it was good that I had those few years to experiment with a lot of different compositions. So in, I think, 2014, I got a grant. So really, it was from the very beginning the idea of a large ensemble, but it just took time. I needed to develop more credibility as a composer, and I needed to develop, honestly, like I'm thankful for all of you who didn't give me that grant in 2010 and whatever, like I needed till 2014, 15 to start writing it. And I mean, now, of course, I'm already, it's 2017, and I'm ready to write another piece for the ensemble, but because I have different, the aesthetics have, developed and evolved. But, so that's where it started.
Okay. And what do you plan for the album? It just came out. Like, what's in store for?
Well, the album is out, and we recorded it all to analog tape, and we mixed it in analog and mastered in analog, which is very rare. People don't really master in analog anymore because it's tedious and it can be expensive if you screw it up. You have to start with a new lacquer and all that. But to me, it was really worth it because the sound maintains a certain when it doesn't go through digital, keep the warmth and keep the continuity of the sound. So the album, we have not exactly a tour. we're playing at Newport August 4th. We're playing in Ann Arbor at University Musical Society October 18th. And then next February we have 4-city tour, Iowa City, Chicago, and New York City. And Washington, D.C. I'm working on. And then there's a lot coming up in the second half of 2018 into 19. And I'm hoping that we'll have a new commission in there so I can write the next piece for this ensemble. Yeah.
And what would you like people to walk away from when they listen to Not To?
I hope that the experience somehow opens people's minds. Because, like, not being... we didn't... Like I was saying, it's analog. The music is open. I mean... There's parts of it that are set, but there's a lot of open. Every performance is a little bit different. And in that sense, I think, when music is monotonous or when it's quantized, when the beat is constant, always the same, doesn't breathe, it doesn't encourage thought, like independent thinking, creative thinking outside of the box or convention. And I think this is one of the problems, we won't get into where society's problems, but one of the,
we're going to solve them right now.
I've been trying. But, like when music becomes very sort of, it can be mind numbing when it's the same beat over and over and over. It can be fun to dance to, but like if you're going to listen to it, it's like, really? Can we just change something, please? So when elements are constantly changing, it keeps your mind active. It keeps and there's something also physical about the experience. Like it's almost like, to me, sometimes parts of it are like having an ear massage, like a brain massage. Like the way that the overtones mix, and just there's a sensual experience. So I want it to be something like a sensual, physical, mental. Spiritual experience that encourages people to be open, open heart, open mind, open sensibility, and hopefully treat each other with kindness and love and respect.
Yeah, I like the sound of that. Best place for people to keep up with you online?
Amir ElSafar.com. I have a Facebook fan page, and and then New Amsterdam Records put out the album, and you can find the album there. There's a link from my homepage too.
It's ambitious 2 albums, double record set too. Record. That's nice.
Yeah, it's about 87 minutes, I think. Yeah.
Excellent, dude. Yeah, good. That was great. Thank you for doing this.
Oh, thank you. It's my pleasure.
This is wonderful.
Great. Thank you.
قصير طريقنا يطول زودينا من حسن وجهك ما دام فحسن الوجود فحسن
And that was Shards of Memory, B half flat fantasy from Amir's Not 2 album featuring the Rivers of Sound Orchestra, out now on New Amsterdam Records. Again, Amir's website is amirelsafar.com, AmirElSafar, and at his website you can find links to buy the new album. You can get it as a download, a double CD, or double vinyl, and it is a beautifully put together project with great liner notes on it and also plenty of photos. So that is amirelsafar.com. I am online several places, several ways, talkmusictalk.com for more information on this very podcast. Plus, you can listen to every single episode there. I also have a personal website, which is thisisvoice.com. You can read excerpts from the novels that I write and also check out my music. And if you are on Instagram, please follow me there at thisisvoice. Call to action for you. Make sure you download the new Talk Music Talk app. Every single episode free for iPhone and Android, and you can get it wherever you like to get your apps. Or you can subscribe to the podcast on iTunes or Google Play, and it would be greatly appreciated, especially if you are on iTunes listening, to leave a 5-star rating because it helps increase the ranking of Talk Music Talk so more people will discover it, which is a great thing. You can also find the podcast on SoundCloud starting with episode 100. That is soundcloud.com/thisisvoice. And once you download or subscribe to the podcast, don't forget the 2 previous episodes with 2 other amazing jazz artists, Josiah Woodson and Mary Halverson. That is episode 134 for Josiah and 135 for Mary Halverson. Links in the show notes, of course. Thank you so much for listening. Till next time, and there will be a next time. This one's for you, Liz.